As we talked about the Gilded Age, we learned that on the surface, America was rich, prosperous. We had a democratic republic, a good form of government. We had freedoms, we had rights, we had cities that were among the most modern and advanced in the world. Our country was growing and everything looked good on the surface. But if you scratched underneath, you realized there was corruption in politics, there was corruption in business, both at the upper levels with the way businesses competed with each other and also with the way workers were treated. There was crimes and problems in the cities. There was segregation and mistreatment of people in the classes of society, rejection of immigrants. There were problems that needed to be addressed. And what we see happen at the turn of the 20th century, as we're nearing the turn of the 20th century in the 1890s, and as we're moving into the 1900s, we see America go through a remarkable period called the Progressive Era, where we see a lot of Americans get interested in fixing these problems and making the country a better place and actually trying to live up to the things that we say we believe in. And what's especially remarkable is it's not just Democrats, it's not just Republicans, it's not just the wealthy, it's not just the poor. It's people of all classes, of different political persuasions, uh, attacking the problems and starting to try to make change. A good way to kind of look at progressivism is it's kind of like an umbrella that a lot of different ideas fit underneath. Not all progressives believed in all progressive programs, but there were a lot of different ideas that all fit under this umbrella of progressivism. And of course, there were many progressives that believed in many of these ideas, and many of these ideas fit very nicely together, but they're all part of progressivism. Now, as we begin looking at progressivism, there's a few groups which kind of become the core group which help feed the progressive movement. One, in rural areas and in the South, you have this group called the populists. They had actually been kind of a grassroots movement trying to fight for the rights of rural farmers and standing up to big businesses like the railroads. And they had ultimately developed into a political party. You also have middle class folks up in New England, in the big cities up north. The middle class was a growing group, and the thing is, the middle class is not so rich, so well off, that they can't sympathize with the poor. And yet they're not so poor and disaffected by the rich that they immediately blame the rich for everything and want to bring down big business. They kind of are in between, and they can see things from a different point of view, and they get concerned about what they see, and they want to make reforms. And what's remarkable about them, whereas working classes, you don't have time to go out and protest. You're working pretty much nonstop all week long. But the middle class has a little bit more time. And one particular group in the middle class that has more time is women. This cult of domesticity, the idea that women's place is in the home, raising the kids, was kind of something that had developed in the industrial age because middle class men could make enough money and their wives could stay home and take care of the kids. You didn't see that in the working classes. The men and the women had to go and make pennies to keep the family going. But middle class women could stay home. So it was a privilege to a certain degree. Now, eventually, as we move through the 20th century, we see women fighting against the limitations that this cult of domesticity idea had put on them, saying, well, the woman's place is in the home. And the traditional long-term thing that, women didn't have a lot of power, didn't have the right to vote and other things. But the cult of domesticity also, to a certain degree, does empower women because as a middle-class woman, you spend, let's say, 20, 30 years raising kids. But being middle class, many women were still healthy and still active, and their children were raised, and they have free time. And now they could get involved in progressive protests and activities and really push making change. And of course, some of that change will specifically include fighting for their own right to vote, because if you're going to be able to make change in other areas, you've got to have some political power. So they become a core group. One other group that really helps drive progressivism in the big cities is the Christian social gospel movement. Now, that may sound a little foreign to you, but you're really familiar with it. Because every Christmas, when you walk into a department store, you walk by somebody with a red kettle ringing a bell. That's the Salvation Army. And that's the Christian social gospel. The idea of the social gospel was this. The Christian gospel is that Jesus Christ came to earth, died for our sins, and if you believe in him, you go to heaven. That's the gospel. Social gospel adds something to that. See, the thing was, if you're a Christian preaching the gospel, you could go to some poor guy living in the slums and say, hey, Jesus loves you, accept him and go to heaven. And then he says a little prayer. You say, good, I'll see you in heaven. And you leave him there to die in squalor. The social gospel says that's not enough. Yes, we want to save his soul, but we want to improve his condition on earth. So let's try to help people that are living in poverty. And so you see groups like the Salvation Army opening soup kitchens, trying to help the poor, opening shelters. And groups like this want to make reform as they see them in the slums of the big cities. So all of these different groups are going to help push progressivism. Now, there's a lot of different goals that progressives are going to be after. What you see here is just a short list. But they're going to want to improve conditions in factories, try to stop child labor and get better pay for workers. They want to improve the living conditions in the slums, make places safer to work in and to live in. They want to regulate big business practices and prevent monopolies and unfair business conditions to protect a free market. They want to clean up corruption in government. And they want to fight crime. And some of them want to help the conditions for farmers and people in rural areas. And there's even an environmental movement where people are wanting to preserve our environment. We've got pollution for the first time on a large scale with these industrial factories, and we've also tamed the West, claimed all the land, and now we're cutting down all the trees and turning everything into someone's property. And there's a movement to try to preserve some of that natural habitat before it's all gone. So these are just some of the things progressives were fighting for. Now, there's just a few of these progressives that we're going to kind of take a look at here. As an example, you'll read about more of them, and you can certainly read about even more. But these are just a few examples of progressive reformers. Probably number one on the progressive reformers list is a woman named Jane Addams. She's famous for creating a place called Hull House in Chicago. Now, when I was a young student going through school, and if I were to ask you, I do this every year, and I ask my class, and every year I ask who lived in Hull House, and people generally are going to say poor folks, and that's not true. She didn't build the house for the poor people she was helping. She built the house as a settlement house. It was for upper class and middle class reformers to move into the slum with the poor so that they could serve the poor. So the idea of Hull House was now there will be people living among those immigrant workers who can teach them English, who can help them learn to read, who can help educate them, who can take care of their kids so their kids don't have to go off to the factory and work, who can provide health care and services for them. That was the idea of Hull House. And you would think something like that, everyone would say, yay, Jane Addams, you're a great person doing good, making the world a better place. But no, no, she got a lot of pushback. A lot of people criticized her. Because remember, she's going in and helping these immigrant workers. And a lot of people didn't like those foreigners. They don't like their culture. They don't like their religion. They don't want those people here. That's always been the case with immigration from the very beginning of America, that there's concerns about the immigrants, whether they're going to corrupt our culture, whether they're going to take our jobs, whether they're going to bring crime, whatever it may be. And some issues are legitimate concerns, but others are just fear. But we see this from the beginnings of our country. And Jane Addams helping this group of people did not make everyone pleased. A lot of people criticized her. They went to such an extreme that there was a rumor going around that Jane Addams had had the devil's baby, and it was living in Hull House. And there may have been some truth at the bottom of this story that some poor kid had been born deformed and was being cared for there, but they made up this story that she and the devil had had a child because she's that bad. So even though some of these guys we look back on and we say, yay, progressive reformers, they're making America a better place, didn't mean everybody liked them then or now. So there will be some pushback against some of these reforms. Now, there's a term called muckrakers. The muckrakers are a bunch of progressives. They're writers, they're authors or journalists, or even in some case photographers. And what they do is they publish work that points to the problems in society so that people will want to reform things. You're doing an assignment, reading a section of Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle, in which he describes the very disgusting process of packing meat. But that wasn't what he was writing about. He was writing about the horrible conditions that these poor workers, these immigrants living in the slums, working in these factories were experiencing. He's famous for having said that he was aiming for America's heart and he punched it in the stomach. He tried to get people concerned about the immigrants, but when people read how nasty the conditions were, as you're going to, in those meatpacking industries, people wanted change. They wanted the meat made safe. And it made such an impact that within just a few months, we had a brand new government organization to do just that. So that was an example of muckraking working. And you had other muckrakers that were writing about corruption in politics, corruption in business. You had Ida Tarbell wrote a book called The History of Standard Oil, in which she decried the practices of Rockefeller, who had destroyed her father's oil company. And you have other muckrakers who write about all kinds of problems, and it helps focus people's attention. Now, another area that you're starting to see really start to make some progress is the temperance movement. It had begun well before the Progressive Era, back before the Civil War. People fighting to stop the sale of alcohol. A lot of people had decided that alcohol was one of our nation's biggest problems and led to a lot of the crime and immorality in our country. And it was kind of considered a woman's issue because if you're a woman and your husband works in a factory, he gets his paycheck, he goes and blows it on alcohol, so you've lost your money and you and the kids aren't being taken care of, and then he comes home drunk and he beats the children and his wife. So it was kind of a woman's issue, but a lot of people were pushing to ban alcohol. Ultimately, we will see this issue result in the 18th Amendment, and we'll talk more about prohibition. But it was a major issue, a moral issue at that time that people were struggling back and forth over. Then there's women's suffrage. That had also begun before the Civil War. Back when women were actually taking an active part in the temperance and in the abolition movements, women found that, hey, we're trying to make change, but we don't have the right to vote. So the women's movement, pushing for women's right to vote, had begun back then. Eventually, Susan B. Anthony became the great champion of the women's movement for the right to vote throughout the mid-19th century. And finally, we will see it succeed with the 19th Amendment after World War I. Another area where we're seeing progressive reforms starting to be made is in the area of African American rights. Ever since the period of Reconstruction ended and Yankee troops went home, we've seen systematically one state after another, as white governments, citizens regained their right to vote and regained control of their governments, they started passing segregation laws. They started to limit the freedoms and certainly the right to vote for African Americans. And so before there's ever Rosa Parks, before there's ever Martin Luther King Jr., or any of the other famous events and people of the civil rights movement that we think about in the mid-20th century, you had over a century of work done by people, many of them forgotten, that were slowly starting to make progress, trying to change the way things were, trying to fight for African American rights. Now, the first guy to really make a name for himself and become a national figure in this struggle for rights was Booker T. Washington. He is going to found Tuskegee Institute. His approach was to say, all right, we're not respected. They don't allow us a lot of rights. So what we've got to do is we've got to work hard and prove we have earned their respect, prove that we deserve these rights. So he didn't want to fight and demand the rights. He wanted to prove that they should have those rights by working hard. Now, that's a good first approach because you're not going to have as quick a resistance to you saying, oh, I just want to work hard. And you're not demanding those rights overtly. So this was his approach, and eventually made him a well-known leader, and presidents would even seek to be seen with him to try to gain what few African-American votes there were out there. But ultimately, as time goes along, we're going to see that that's not pushing hard enough. That's not going to get the job done fully, but it's a good first start. Eventually, W.E.B. Du Bois, he's going to come around, and he is one of this new group of African-American leaders who say, no, we've got to demand better treatment. We've got to stand up for the rights that we have legally. And so he's going to help form the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. He'll help publish a newspaper to point to different issues that African Americans are fighting for, and we'll see a more direct approach demanding rights. Now, we start to see tiny little bits of progress in the early 20th century, and we're going to see a backlash against that. We'll talk more about that later as you read in the 1920s. Eventually, the Ku Klux Klan will be reborn to push back against civil rights. But they're making small progresses. And this is going on throughout the progressive movement. Now, with all these different progressive reforms, be they trying to change things in business or in politics or whatever it is, you're going to have a hard time getting it done without leadership in the government. You're going to need some presidents to step up and fight for reforms. And this is what's remarkable. We're going to see both Democrats and Republicans help lead this fight. The first president that really gets involved is one of my favorite characters historically. I don't agree with everything he ever did, but I like this guy because he's such a remarkable personality. Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt had been born privileged and wealthy, but he will be a progressive reformer that wants to help common Americans. He had, as a younger man, gone out west, bought a ranch so he could be a cowboy and see the West before it was gone. And he actually did the work out there and chased rustlers. And then when the Spanish-American War broke out, he had a desk job in Washington. But no, he's got to be on the battlefield. And after the war, he uses his record as a war hero to eventually become governor of New York. And he starts making reforms. And he starts trying to limit big businesses. He's using his position as governor to push progressivism, which did not make Republican stalwarts happy. They had to find a way to silence it, and they did. It was a brilliant move. They said, as governor of New York, he's got a lot of power. But when McKinley runs for re-election in 1900, he's going to need a new vice president since his vice president, Hobart, just died. So let's ask Roosevelt. Roosevelt will become vice president, where he'll have no power, and we'll silence him. And that worked. Roosevelt ran for vice president, and they thought they had gotten rid of Roosevelt because they never intended to run him as a president. But just a few months later, McKinley was assassinated by a fellow by the name of Zolgost, who was just an anarchist. And suddenly, in the words of one of those stalwarts, that damn cowboy is president? And Roosevelt starts using his position as president as what he called a bully platform to make reforms. And so, one of the first things he does is he tests off that old Sherman Antitrust Act, and he actually starts going after monopolies and stopping monopolies. So for the first time, we're seeing it actually used for what it was written for. Furthermore, he helps push out the Elkins Act, which is going to limit the kickbacks that railroads are getting as they expanded. He creates the Department of Commerce and Labor to try to get better treatment of workers. And when big strikes break out, he sides with the workers, not the big businesses. He's actually changing conditions in our industrial area of America. He's trying to make change. The Pure Food and Drug Act is a direct result of the jungle. He gets that done quickly. And he even starts to create national parks to set aside some of this land, which he loves. So, as president, he serves out the rest of McKinley's term. And when he runs for re-election, he promises, following Washington's example of only serving 2 terms, he says, I will consider my first term here, serving off McKinley's term, as my first term of office. And so if you re-elect me for a second term, I will step down after a second term. So he wins in 1904, and he was an extremely popular president. Come 1908, he's an extremely popular president still, but he's promised America he'll step down. And he did. And he handpicked his successor, his good friend William Howard Taft, who he believed would continue his progressive reforms. But he really didn't want to give up the power. He loved being president. But he did. And then he went on a big game hunting expedition to Africa. But when he got back, he was kind of nitpicking everything Taft did because he really wanted back in the political game. He wanted an excuse to be president again. And so he watches what Taft is doing closely. Now, Taft, actually, a lot of historians believe he did more to reform big business than Roosevelt did. He continues to limit monopolies. But he does raise the tariff, which made stalwarts happy with him, and they felt like they were starting to kind of get some control over him. As far as foreign policy went, Roosevelt had continued our gunboat diplomacy of exercising our naval power in Central and South America to settle disputes with foreign countries. Taft extends that into what he calls dollar diplomacy, where he wants to not just use military intervention, but he wants to encourage American businesses to invest down there and develop these countries, which is a good thing in some ways. We're going to develop them. In other ways, American businessmen were getting rich and exploiting some of the workers in some cases. So it's always kind of a mixed bag, depending on how you want to view it. But he was doing what he believed in, trying to use American capitalism to make these places better and to hopefully build goodwill. And in some cases, he did. So he's a very strong progressive president, and he's trying to make improvements. But Roosevelt is just picking apart everything he does, and especially criticizing his cozying up with the stalwarts. And so when his first term of office comes to an end, Roosevelt throws his hat in the ring and tries to win the Republican nomination. But he can't, because the stalwarts are going to block that. But that didn't stop Roosevelt. He just went out and formed a brand new political party, the Progressive Party. And he needed a symbol for that party. So when somebody asked, are you ready for this election? And he said, I feel as fit as a bull moose. And so the bull moose becomes the animal associated as the symbol of this party. So he's out there campaigning against Taft as a third party candidate. And he's really doing well. But towards the end of the campaign, he's going to give a speech. And one of these nut job anarchists decides he's going to shoot Roosevelt. So Roosevelt gets out of his car, and he's about to walk into the auditorium and give this big speech. This guy walks up, puts a gun to his chest, pulls the trigger, and puts a bullet in Roosevelt. After this guy is tackled, Roosevelt gets up, brushes himself off, says, no, just take him to jail, don't rough him up. And they say, but we got to get you to the hospital. He takes a look at the bullet wound, and he says, hey, it's okay. He got a handkerchief shoved in the hole, and he went and gave an hour-long speech with a bullet in his chest. That's the kind of guy Roosevelt is. But it probably cost him, because it was actually a fairly serious wound, even though it wasn't bleeding that much. And he won't be able to get back out on the campaign trail again. Instead, he'll be hospitalized for a lengthy period of time. He'll have to stop campaigning. And in the end, because he and Taft were splitting the Republican vote, the Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, ends up winning the election. Now, Taft has a happy ending to his story. Taft, he was brokenhearted the way things went down between him and his former friend, and Roosevelt had said some really nasty things about him, kind of calling him fat and stupid during the election campaign. He actually literally cried over this. He had a hard time, and being president was hard on him. But the happy ending to all of that is Taft had a hard time being president. It was a brutal job. He was the biggest president we ever had, and he even put on weight eating for comfort while he was president. But when he got out of office and no longer had that pressure on him, he got in better shape, lost a little weight, and eventually he became a Supreme Court justice, where he shined. He's the only president to have ever been president and then justice of the Supreme Court. So he ends up with a job that he loves at the end of his life, and things end well for Taft. Now, meanwhile, Roosevelt, he doesn't win election, and so he goes off exploring a new branch of the Amazon River, and eventually, in a few years, he will finally pass away, probably by wearing himself out and getting sick while he was down there exploring the Amazon. But Roosevelt passes from the scene, and now Wilson steps up. Wilson becomes the first Southerner to be elected since the Civil War. And Wilson initially had campaigned on a platform of making progressive reforms and bringing down these big businesses. But once he becomes president, he becomes a bit more moderate and realizes that wouldn't be good for the American economy. And he ends up more following Roosevelt's plan of just limiting and regulating these businesses to prevent monopolies. Now, as a progressive, his real focus was on big business. So he ends up lowering the tariff. Unfortunately, as a side effect of lowering the tariff, since we weren't bringing in tax money that way, as a progressive reform, they came up with the idea of a federal income tax. So the U.S. government will take a tiny, just a few pennies out of each of our paychecks, and collectively we'll pay our bills and won't need a tariff. Well, that was a nice idea, but you know what happened. You've seen your paycheck. That's a big old hunk that Uncle Sam takes every time you get a paycheck. It just grew and grew and grew and grew. But this is where it started as a progressive reform. Well, he gets rid of the tariff. He passes the Federal Reserve Act to try to organize and put some regulations in the banking system, which was good. Unfortunately, it didn't go far enough, as we're going to see a couple of decades later with the Great Depression. We'll get to that later. The Clayton Antitrust Act further extended the power of the old Sherman Antitrust Act for the government to regulate and stop monopolies. The Federal Trade Commission continues, he uses that to continue to try to regulate, but not destroy, big business. And at this point, once he feels like he's got these monopolies and he's got big business under control, he makes a declaration to the world: we did it! Progressivism is finished! We've succeeded! And women said, where's our vote? African Americans said, where's our rights? Immigrants said, we're still living in squalor, and our pay is horrible, our conditions are terrible. And on and on and on down the list. Progressives all over the place said, what are you doing? We got a lot more to do. And his advisors come to him and say, Mr. President, if you're wanting to get reelected, you can't go making declarations like that. You got to keep performing. And so he had to throw in a couple more reforms before the election to convince people he was still a progressive. So along comes the Keaton child labor law, where they're going to put a limit on how young a child can be to work in a factory. And we're also going to see an establishment federally of an 8-hour workday as the standard on railroads. Now, railroads are interstate commerce, so the federal government can regulate that. So it doesn't change that on every business, but it becomes the standard. And within the next couple of decades, it goes from it just being the railroad with an 8-hour workday to eventually that becomes the standards across all businesses. So a few more reforms are made. And of course, over the next couple of decades, there will continue to be one reform after another as part of the progressive movement eventually happening. But after he gets reelected, there's another issue America is about to face, and it's not progressivism. The other thing that he could say in that re-election campaign in 1916 was not only that he was a progressive, but Wilson was able to brag, "I kept you out of war." In 1914, World War I had begun, and it was becoming a bloodbath, and we weren't in it, and we were happy about that. And Wilson ran on that platform that he kept us out of that war. But as we're going to see in his second term, it wouldn't be long before events in Europe will drag us into that war.